Hare Krishna. Today's class will be a little different. You will see. Hey, Bhakti wanted to watch. Can you text her the link? Yeah, text. Okay. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. We're on Zoom? Hi there, I see me. Okay, so this is a most interesting chapter. We're beginning with what verse are we beginning with? 35. Okay. Let me put this in context. This is, as some of you may know, is the Uddhava Gita. Now, the Uddhava Gita is Krishna speaking to Uddhava, just like the Bhagavad Gita is Krishna speaking to Arjuna. In the Uddhava Gita, more detail comes than the Gita. Now, why does a Bhagavad Gita not have as much detail as, for example, the Uddhava Gita? Why? I'd wait. Yeah, I mean, they blew the conch shells. That means within 30 minutes, arrows and weapons are going to be flying. You have 30 minutes. How many of you have had an existential crisis like that? 30 minutes before your exam and you hadn't opened the book yet. I mean, it happens to all of us. I mean, 10 minutes before the class and you hadn't studied yet. I mean, these things happen. So, the Uddhava Gita is a little more relaxed and goes into more detail. This is a section that when you're done reading it, and if you read this carefully, and there's too many verses for us to read it all today, you will be mostly convinced that you're not this body. Why do I say mostly? Because you can't just get there intellectually. Intellectually can get you to the point where you can begin the process to understand it more deeply. But you will, that's what this chapter takes you. So we'll begin with verse let me see, 35 to 36. Just now coming. Okay. Sri Uddhava Vacha Tatvata Parvati Diya Svaya Krita Karmanabi Prabhu Uchavanyata Dehan Grahani Vishjanti Cha. Sri Uddhava said, O Supreme Master, the intelligence of these dedicated or fruitive activities is certainly deviated from you. Please explain to me how such persons accept superior and inferior bodies by their materialistic activities and then give up such bodies. Oh, Govinda, this topic is very difficult for foolish persons, in other words, all of us, to understand. Being cheated by illusion in this world, they generally do not become aware of these facts. So, and in a purport, no one can be considered intelligent without understanding the science of God, which includes a description of the negative results of those who have forgotten their relationship with Him. There are many so-called wise men in the world, But although considering themselves to be the most intelligent, they generally do not to surrender to the supreme intelligence of the Lord. This is referring to like great philosophers, like David Hume, very famous philosopher. Who's familiar with David Hume? So what did David Hume say? Okay, we're familiar. David Hume basically said, you can't know anything. He went into this existential crisis. Well, I can never be sure that any cause, any effect is a result of a particular cause. Therefore, we can't know anything, and became a radical skeptic. And people like that generally go insane. I don't know if David Hume did or not, but so you get these philosophers, and you have, in my college days, I was a fan of the existential philosophers. Who has read some of them? Sartre and Camus. Sartre wrote a book called Nausea. Now, this was after World War II. And in World War II, there was terrible carnage. I mean, just unbelievable carnage. You have the Holocaust and soldiers fighting. And World War II was very shortly after World War I. I mean, we're talking 20 years. It's not a long time. I mean, right now, we're going back to after 9/11. Between after 9/11 and now, it's a short period of time. So you had this horrible World War I. In World War I, they used something called mustard gas. So the troops were in trenches, the Germans and the Allies, in France and that area. And they would lob these canisters of gas, and the gas would fall into the trench. And when the gas cloud would come, it would destroy your lungs and you couldn't breathe. That's actually been outlawed now in war. America just last week destroyed its last canisters of the gas. I'm sure there's a few rogues out there that still have some. So you had the horror of World War I, the horror of World War II, which was, immense devastation, carpet bombings of cities, never been done in the history that we know of, where whole cities were bombed to oblivion. So the Germans were bombing London, but the Royal Air Force had a few new inventions such as radar and were able to not be destroyed. But then when the Americans entered the war with thousands of bombers, they would just fly over German cities and obliterate them to nothing. Then later on, World War II ended with total obliteration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Total obliteration. It's never been done in warfare before. You take a city and you obliterate it. It doesn't exist on the earth. I had a professor, I was taking some classes at the University of Florida. There was this old professor, Hartley. And in World War II, he was a intelligence officer in the Pacific. And the general came to him one day and said, Bartley, give me 2 more targets I need, and the war will be over soon. Now, everyone thought after Iwo Jima, the war would go on for 5-10 years. Every Japanese soldier, they would never surrender. They would fight until the last man died. And imagine trying to just conquer one island, 25,000 Americans, I think, were killed. Imagine little island, imagine conquering all of Japan. And so when he said this to Bartley said, my God, the war can't end that soon, but the general had a secret. And he couldn't tell him the secret. He said, oh, don't worry. Just give me 2 targets that meet this and this criteria. The weather will be like this, has some industrial capacity and all that. So Bartley picked 2 targets, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Does that ring a bell with anyone? That's where the atomic bombs were dropped. He had no idea he was picking those targets. When he told that story, I was like shocked. But that's what happened. So we had this total destruction. Just complete chaos of a war that was more vicious than anything we know in few thousand years of human history. Then you get Sartre coming. And Sartre writes a book called Nausea, because he realized just how horrible the world was and the existential crisis. And he felt that each of us, the whole burden of the world is on our shoulders. We have to make decisions that are impossible to make. I won't go into more detail now, but you had this philosophical conundrum where people just didn't know what to think anymore. And it actually opened the door to deeper Vedic knowledge, because Western philosophers got stumped. They couldn't figure out what's going on. And the Uddhava Gita gives a lot of insight into this. So Krishna, I'm going to read a few selected verses. The material mind of men is shaped by the reactions of fruit of work, along with the five senses that travels from one body to another. The spirit soul is different from the mind. And this verse is very, very nice. The next one, verse 38. The mind, bound to the reaction of fruit of work, always meditates on the object of the senses, both those that are seen in this world and those that are heard from Vedic authority. Consequently, the mind appears to come into being, to suffer along with the objects of perception, and thus its ability to distinguish past and future is lost. What does that mean? Ability to distinguish past and future. Well, I'll surprise all of you. I can see past and future. Okay? Who believes me? Oh, really? Surprised? Shocking. Okay. And so can you. It just requires understanding. I'll give you an example. Let us say we're going downtown Gainesville and we see some homeless bums, as we used to call them. Unfortunate people really suffering. And I don't know if it still is. At one time, Krishna House was the largest purveyor of cooked food to the homeless in Gainesville. I don't know if we still do that. It's delivered, yeah. So, I mean, we want to give them prasadam. But when I'm looking at that and I see someone suffering like that, I know their past. I don't know the details of their past, but I know, my God, what did they do to get in this position? I can see their past. Let's say you find some horrible person. I'll give you an example. There was a drug lord in Colombia named, I think, Oriental. And he was one of the meanest people on the planet. He would go into whole villages and just kill and rape and plunder just to show that he's powerful, so the next village would fear him. And he was the biggest drug lord in all of Colombia. And 20 helicopters about a year ago flew into the jungle and captured him in a big firefight. His brother was killed and now he's extradited to America. And I know all the details on it because it was my son that captured him. Daddies are proud of their kids. My son's a federal agent. He was the one that arranged the capture. So I just watched a National Geographic special on that. So, you know, fathers like boasting a little. Anyway, this guy was just so horrible. I know what his future is going to be. I can see his future. I mean, when you do something so horrible, he may the day before he was captured, he's living, thousands of soldiers he has under him. He has his different hiding places. He probably has his, many ladies serving his every need, and everything he wanted, he had. And then one day it's gone. And then what will his future be? He'll be lucky, extremely lucky, if he was a homeless person in the street of Gainesville. His fate would be much worse. So when you see someone enjoying, you know what their future is. I can see their future, and so can you. When you see someone suffering, you know their past. Now, we don't know the details. Why don't we know the details? Well, Krishna talks about that. In the Gita, he says to Arjuna, so many lives have I lived. So many lives have I lived. But I mean, so many lives have you lived, he says. But I can remember everything, but you can't. Imagine if you could remember all your previous mothers and fathers. That'd make you in a very miserable position. There's one story in the Bhagavatam where one king, what was the king's name? Slips my mind. His son died. And Narada Muni came. What's that? Chitraketu, and brought the son back. And the father's lamenting, why would you leave me? I'm your father. And the son says, which father? I've had so many fathers, because he remembered his previous lives. So many, which one? Then the father became realized. So many fathers. But if we remembered it all, we'd be crazy people. So by mercy, some people say, why don't I remember my previous lives? Well, we don't, but sometimes we do, and we'll get to that in a minute. That's your surprise today. So, when the living entity passes from the present body to the next, which is created by his own karma, he becomes absorbed in the pleasure and sensations of the new body and completely forgets the experience of the previous body. This total forgetfulness of one's previous identity, which comes about for one reason or another, is called death. So at death, we forget these things. And what is called birth is simply a person's total identification with a new body. One accepts the new body just as one completely accepts the experience of a dream or a fantasy in reality. You've all had this. You've all, I'm sure, seen a movie one time or another. And when you're watching the movie, it might be, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom or something. You're watching this now. I won't ask who's seen it. Okay, so obviously I wouldn't watch such a thing. Anyway, so I know. Anyway, that takes place in India. It's kind of cool. So you get very absorbed in it, and when all of a sudden on the screen somebody is about to be crushed by a rock, your heart is racing, your pulse is just, you can feel it, and just vibrating in your wrist, you're sweaty. I mean, all this is going on. You better eat some more popcorn to calm down. I mean, you're there, you're part of this. So that's what it's like being in a new body. It's like that. It's like watching a movie. And now with virtual reality, the line between reality and who we are gets a little bit even more blurry. So just as a person experiences a daydream or dream, does not remember his previous dreams or daydreams, a person situated in his present body, though having existed prior to it, thinks he has only recently come into being. Because of the mind, which is a resting place of the senses, has created the identification with the new body, the threefold material variety. I'm going to stop here for a moment. So, what are we talking about here? I got to cue something up for a moment. Okay. So we're talking about when you enter a new body, you don't remember your old body. Is that true? Not always. Not always. And there is a professor named Ian Stevenson who has passed on. He was, I believe, a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia. And he was an ordinary child psychiatrist, the other, and studying cases. And he kept coming across these odd cases where a child, always under 5, would remember their previous life. And he started studying it. Is there any reality to this? Or is this just, he watched too many cartoons or something? And he studied 2,500 cases, he and his successor, which is Jim Tucker. And that study still goes on at the University of Virginia. And in fact, our Akandadi and our Kunal just spent a whole day at the University of Virginia meeting with the folks from Division of Perceptual Studies. This is extremely legitimate scholars. And our Bhaktivedanta Institute, which is looking at this, has a crew in India right now studying past life stories. Most of the stories, though not all, come from India. Why India? So yes, why these stories are more prominent in India than America? Say again? I'm not hearing you so well. Data is extremely poorly organized in India. What is extremely Oh, wait. Well, the reason is a little simpler. The reason is when these stories come up, Americans just write them off as silliness. In India, because everyone knows reincarnation is true, they actually look into it. So that's a simple reason. But it does occur in America, and I'm going to show you a few. Would you like to see a few stories like this? Let me get this queued up. I did queue it up before coming. Here it is. Well, no, it's the wrong one to start with. Let me just queue it up. Okay, this is Jim Tucker, who has presented to our BI group, and we work with closely, a very rational, really good scientist. Okay. Sorry, a little technical things here. Okay. That didn't work well. Okay, sorry about that. I should have probably had Nitai cue this. We'll try one more time here. We'll get this to work.
It's really a question as old as the ages, of course. What happens when we die? And is it possible that the dead return, reborn as others? Okay, it's a leap for many of us, maybe.
Does anyone here believe in reincarnation?
I really don't.
Before you dismiss the idea, there's a young boy you need to meet. NBC's Cynthia McFadden is here with a remarkable story. Cynthia, good morning.
Good morning. It's really a question as old as the ages, of course. What happens when we die? And is it possible that the dead return, reborn as others? Okay, it's a leap for many of us, maybe most Americans, but recently we met a little boy and his mother who are convinced he lived a previous life. They persuaded us to take a closer look. And while their story doesn't prove reincarnation exists, it sure does make you wonder. Meet Ryan, a 10-year-old boy from the Midwest who says he's been here before. Does this have any meaning for you now?
I'm pretty sure that's one of my wives.
Is 10-year-old Ryan a boy with an overactive imagination? Or the reincarnation of a man who died more than a half-century ago? It's a mystery that began when he was just 5.
It was scary at times because he wouldn't sleep at night. He would wake up in the middle of the night screaming and crying. One night, he said, "Mom, I have something I need to tell you. I think I used to be somebody else." He started just telling me these stories about how he had lived in Hollywood.
Had you ever given much thought to this whole idea of reincarnation?
No, ma'am. I grew up in a Baptist church. You know, that's not something that we were taught to believe in.
And so she tried to keep it a secret, worried everyone would think her son was crazy.
But when we found the picture, it changed everything.
A photo in a book about the golden age of Hollywood.
She turns to a page in the book, and it's black and white, and I say, "That's me." That's who I was.
That's me.
Yeah.
And you thought?
I just was stunned.
The picture was from the movie Night After Night, the film debut of Mae West.
Goodness, what beautiful diamonds. Goodness had nothing to do with it, dearie.
Her lines were memorable, but that unnamed extra, the man who Ryan pointed to, he was in just 2 scenes and didn't speak a single word.
This was the picture that his mom sent me.
Finally, Ryan's memories could be attached to a face, but who was he? Ryan's mother turned to this man for help, Dr. Jim Tucker, a child psychiatrist at the University of Virginia. For 50 years, researchers here have tracked 2,500 cases of children claiming past lives.
And your conclusion is what?
These cases demand an explanation, that we can't just write them off.
He's written about many of them in his book, Return to Life. But he says few of his cases have as many details as Ryan's.
How he had danced on Broadway and then had gone to Hollywood to work in the movies. Then he had worked for an agency, seen the world from big boats, talked about going to Paris. All of this, frankly, seemed quite unlikely to me for an extra with no lines in the movie.
Ryan also remembered he had 2 sisters, that he was married 5 times, and lived on a street with the word rock in it. He even asked his mother for True-Aid, a brand of orange soda discontinued 50 years before he was born.
And it would be, my last room was grander. I want to go back to my swimming pool. When I wanted to go somewhere, I went down and saw the boys down at the bank, and they gave me the money, and I went.
Behaving like this Hollywood mogul, not like the 5-year-old child.
Exactly.
It took a Hollywood archivist to finally identify the man in that old movie. His name, Marty Martin. And just like Ryan said, he'd become a powerful Hollywood agent.
Ryan had talked about how people would change their names at the agency, and of course, the talent agency, they were changing people's names all the time.
And Martin did dance on Broadway, travel the world, had 2 sisters, and even went to Paris with his wife. It was his 5th wife. And that street with the word rock in it, Martin lived on Roxbury Drive in Beverly Hills. His daughter even confirmed he had a craving for orange soda, just like Ryan said. We found a bottle of that long-forgotten brand on eBay.
Of course, a lot of people are going to say, come on, this is the parent or somebody else giving them information.
I mean, it's just inconceivable that the parents, for some reason, had done all that. This information wasn't on the internet.
But even with the 55 specific things Ryan said that turned out to be true, one claim still bothered Dr. Tucker.
He said he didn't see why God would let you get to be 61 and then make you come back as a baby. So that looked like just an incorrect statement.
That's because Marty Martin's death certificate stated he was 59 when he died.
Since then, I've gotten information that the death certificate was actually incorrect, which would have made Marty Martin 61 when he died.
So he was just lying about his age like everybody else in Hollywood.
Or is a typo on the death certificate, or, who knows what.
Right.
Ryan was right all along.
Are you glad you've had this experience?
Yes, I am.
Does it still feel real to you now that you're 10? I still feel like it's real, and it is kind of fading.
A chance to let go of the past and just be a kid.
So Ryan headed off from our interview to go play paintball. You can read more.
What's that? Yeah. So there are 2,500 of these cases documented in the files. Now, you saw Jim Tucker. He's going to be, we visited him, our team, about a month ago. And after Condity left here, that's where he went. And Jim Tucker is going to come visit us, hopefully in the fall, and give some talks on it. His colleague at the University of Virginia, Bruce Grayson, again, just like Jim Tucker, a psychiatrist, a brilliant, cool-headed speaker. His specialty is quite intriguing. He is the world expert on near-death experiences. Experiences that somebody's on the operating table, tell you an actual case, and their heart stops. All the brainwaves stop. They're clinically dead, and they get revived. Then they come back, and then they tell a story. But one story was, if you go on the roof of the hospital, the patient was never there, you'll find there's a toy fire engine. They go on the roof, and there's a toy fire engine. Story like after a story like this, things that are impossible to relate to. Now, these are rare. Why are these rare? Because we don't normally remember our previous lives. We don't normally have these out-of-body experiences. Though our own Murli Gopal just went to Portugal to the Institute for Consciousness Studies, and he spent a week doing out-of-body experiences with a team of really top researchers in Europe. So these things are not our common experience because Krishna says in the Gita, you don't remember these things, but there's some evidences there. And that's how science works. When we look at science, we're looking for evidences we wouldn't ordinarily see. The great scientific innovations come that way. There's something that we just need to go a little deeper, and there's evidences. So the evidence comes from Shastra, which we're reading, and the evidence comes from science, and they both coalesce extremely well, which is what we do with the Bhaktivedanta Institute. So I'm just going to read a little bit more. I do have one more video to show on this. I don't know, maybe I'll show a little piece of it. This interesting to you, these videos? Yeah, okay. Let's see. What did I do with that one? This one is this is one of the most documented ones around, and it is stranger than strange. I won't show the whole thing because it would go too long, but we will give it a piece.
Psychiatrists use science to unlock the secrets of reincarnation. Since the 1960s, the Division of Perceptual Studies has been collecting cases of children who claim past life memories. They now have files on 2,500 children.
Well, I think what the research shows is that for people who are open to considering the possibility that there is evidence that consciousness at times can exist separately from a functioning brain. So in the cases of these children's reports, if you look at the best cases, they provide evidence that at times there can be this carryover of memories and emotions that seem carried over from one life and continue on in another.
May 2000, Lafayette, Louisiana. A mother awakens to hear the screams of her 2-year-old son.
He was laying on his back, and he was kicking his feet up like...
We'll skip this one because I'm having technical troubles. This is a fascinating, well-researched story about a kid who always, as a young boy, played with airplanes and crashed them. And then he remembered that he kept having this reoccurring dream he would share with his parents, like 3 years old, 4 years old, that I was in an airplane that crashed and was shot down by the Japanese. And then he remembered the name of the ship he was on. And he remembered his name was James This Life. And he said, and that was my name, James. And they researched it. And he went into exquisite detail. And his father researched, and then the University of Virginia got into it. They found that ship, and they found the shipmates of James who died in that crash. And the details were astonishingly correct, and some of them had never been published anywhere so that anyone could have seen it. It was only by these interviews. Again, these are rare, but it happens. So I thought I'd share with you a little something different in the Bhagavatam class today. Remember, I have two goals of giving a class. One, stay awake. That's the hard one. And the second one is not telling you what to think, but just telling you to think. a lot of telling you what to think, but more importantly, and this is what Prabhupada instructed me, learn how to think deeply. Why is that? Because if we really understand these concepts, not just because they were told to us and repeated, but we actually grasp them, then we will stay and get deeper and deeper in our realization. And if we don't grasp these concepts, eventually we'll go. Prabhupada once said, don't be amazed that people leave Krishna consciousness. Be amazed they stay. So only it's very special to stay, as all of you are doing. Although the material body, Krishna is speaking here to Uddhava, is different from the self because of the ignorance to the material association, one falsely identifies with the superior and inferior bodily conditions. Sometimes, this is all of you, a fortunate person is able to give up such mental concoction. By the death of one's father, grandfather, one can surmise one's own death, and by the birth of one's son, one can understand the conditions of one's own birth. A person who thus realistically understands the creation and destruction of material bodies is no longer subject to these dualities. One who desires the birth of a tree from its seed and the ultimate death, and one who observes the birth of a tree from its seed and ultimately the death of the tree after maturity, certainly remains a distinct observer separate from the tree. In the same way, the witness of birth and death of the material body remains separate. In other words, we're watching death. Now, how that has a lot to do with me becoming a devotee. We'll tell a brief story. When I was a kid, let's say 10, 15, that range, what do kids normally do in the suburbs for entertainment? In those before video games and all of that. What's that? Ride a bike? Yeah, I did that. Play ball. One season was football, one was basketball, one was baseball, sometimes soccer. It was always a ball. I can't play ball. I'm legally blind in one eye and I have no depth perception. So I didn't know that until I was 18. I was operated on when I was a kid, but no one ever told me or my parents that I have no depth perception. That was the biggest blessing of my life, a blessing that's inconceivably good. So if I have no depth perception and I didn't know it, what do I think of myself? I'm some kind of, you say, spastic. I can't hit a ball, I can't catch a ball. Impossible. To this day, you throw me keys, I have no idea how to catch them. It's inconceivable, because it takes two eyes to do that. Our depth perception works from about 2 feet to 15, 20 feet. And after that, our eyes are too close together. They'd be farther apart to have depth perception. So, what do you do when all the kids are playing ball and you don't fit in? You go hide in the woods. So I hid in the woods, forest there, and just think. And something bothered me, and it bothered me deeply. But I never would have, if I had played ball, I would have been distracted by the ball. And what bothered me, I never would have looked at. And what bothered me was one thing, and it practically obsessed me. I saw people dying, my neighbor's grandfather, my other neighbor's grandmother, my own dear grandmother. And I understood no one could die, but people were dying. What was the secret of death? Bothered the hell out of me. So I read books, meditated, even prayed, God, what is death? I had no answers, but it didn't make sense because intuitively, we all know that no one can die. We all can feel it, but we're seeing people die. What is that mystery? So fortunately, Krishna poked out an eye somehow at me, and I was able to hide in the woods and think about these things. If I hadn't done that for 10 years, when I met Prabhupada being 22, I never could have had a dialogue with him like I had. Because I had 10 years of thinking, maybe more, of thinking about these things, reading philosophy books, trying to understand something. So sometimes we get a misfortune, and the misfortune is the luckiest thing we have. So that's one of the lessons that I learned, that all our misfortunes are really, we might not see it, our fortune. There was one story like that. I'll tell a little side story for a moment. There was once a king who had a prime minister. And the king and the prime minister were best of friends. And one day the king was practicing his bow and arrow, and something slipped, and he lost a finger. And the prime minister turns to the king and he says, "Krishna's mercy." The king was furious. He couldn't believe it. He put his prime minister in jail. "Krishna's mercy. I lost my finger. How could you say that?" Then the king did what kings do. He goes off in the woods. Usually he would go with the prime minister, but he goes off to practice his archery or whatever in the woods. And some dacoits, thieves, caught him. And they were Kali worshippers. And they were going to sacrifice him to Kali. And he was alone. And they cleaned him and put on this clean cloth and tied him to a pole, and they're about to light the fire to sacrifice him. And one of the dacoits noticed he was missing a finger. He said, "Oh, we cannot sacrifice somebody who doesn't have all their fingers. That would be offensive to Kali." And they let him go. So the king went back, and immediately he released the prime minister from jail. He says, I'm really sorry that I put you in jail. You were right. It was Krishna's mercy. Missing the finger saved my life. But how is it Krishna's mercy? You were in jail for a year for doing nothing wrong. And the prime minister said, that was also Krishna's mercy. I got all my fingers. I always go with you. They would have sacrificed me. So we can see everything as Krishna's mercy. And so what's being described here is when difficulties happen to us, we can understand there's a reason, there's lessons to be learned. And this is what Krishna is teaching Uddhava. So, and towards the end, so at the end, Uddhava says, "Oh, best of all speakers." By the way, I can't read all the verses, but any of you who really want to understand you're not this body, and this is Purushottam a month, so we should do extra reading every day. Read chapter 22, the last half of the chapter. It's really worth reading, and just not time to read it all. "Oh, best of all speakers, explain me how I may properly understand this. O soul of the universe," Krishna says, "the conditioning of one's personality in material life is very strong. Therefore, it is very difficult even for learned men to tolerate the offenses committed against them by ignorant people. Only your devotees who are fixed in your loving service, who have achieved peace by resigning your lotus feet, are able to tolerate such offenses." The prime minister totally tolerated the offense by the king because he was transcendentally situated. So the summary of this chapter is, you're not this body. All kinds of evidence is given that you're this body. And then finally, at the end, Krishna says to Uddhava, "And tolerate offenses committed by ignorant people, because those who have achieved peace are able to tolerate such offenses." With that, we'll conclude here, and we have time for one or two questions. Yes.
When we speak about reincarnation and the life,
Is that, that one's not working either. Yell. Yeah, yell, and I'll repeat it for the audience.
When we speak about reincarnation and NDEs, near-death experiences,
Yeah.
to what extent there is a lack of evidence, and to what, because it seems like it's overwhelming amount of evidence.
Yeah.
And to what extent there is a systemic repression that might be coming not only from scientific world but also from Christian world, that we can have that.
So he's asking, what's a repression of the evidence of reincarnation? Well, Christians sometimes have a lot of piety we appreciate. Sometimes their philosophy gets a little weird. For example, the animals have no soul. I mean, you know, my wife has her service dog, Gora, who has feelings and has a 50, 60 word vocabulary. Not that he speaks, but he understands. He expresses himself everything he wants by body language. To say he has no soul is absurd. Any of you who had a pet hamster, a pet dog, a pet anything, know this is true. You see all the evidence, but the animal has no soul. It's silliness. So there's if you have bad philosophy, it screws up the mind. Just like David Hume, his mind got screwed up because of bad philosophy. So one of the most important things we do in this movement is good philosophy, because good philosophy helps the mind be clear and sharp and understand things. So, but Krishna does say in the Gita, we don't really remember previous lives. That's kind of rare, because if we did, life would be miserable. I mean, these kids that had it, every one of these kids that was remembering nightmares, traumas, it's difficult. I mean, it's mercy we don't, but enough of them out there do have it, so give us some faith. So I hope that answers your question. Yes, Prabhu, what's your question?
Hare Krishna, thank you for the class, Prabhu. My question or comment is related to what Advaita Prabhu just said. There's a mountain of evidence, but to me it seems clear that desire is the most important element. Even if there is an objective, absolute truth out there, whether you're going to access it or take heed of what it says, it really depends on your desire, the desire of the soul. So I think, there's enough evidence out there, but the world, the collective consciousness, we desire a certain kind of lifestyle that's outside of the Vedic paradigm. And therefore, somehow we just don't take it seriously.
And we can change our desires. That's the point. I mean, there was a time that I desired when I was 10 years old to be Superman. I thought that was cool. My father set up a rope in the basement and a harness so I could fly. So we have immature desires. And later on, we get mature desires. And how do we get mature desires? By associating with people who have mature desires. So that's sadhu sangha. So I asked Prabhupada, what's the secret of advancement? Because I was the only guest at the first Mayapur festival. 60, 70 devotees, I've told this story, all very young, zealous, preaching to me the most important thing, and each one had their own idea of what was most important. Worshiping Tulsi is most important, eating prasad, getting up early, chanting, whatever, the whole long list. And I was confused, what is most important? So I'd ask Prabhupada, what is really most important? And that is good association. That's most important. There was a study done. This study would be illegal now, by institutional controls wouldn't allow it. But way back in the 50s, 60s, sometime then, a study was done. And the question is, which is more important, nature or nurture? Nature meaning your DNA, how you're born, or nurture, how you're brought up. Who says nature? Who says nurture? Who says, by nurture, I mean your parents. Who says your parents? Okay, you're wrong. So, and they took twins that were born from unwed mothers. In those days, unwed mothers was a big shame. And so the children were often, somebody gets pregnant in high school, the kids are adopted. The pregnant lady goes away to some distant relative in another state, has her baby, and comes back, oh, I was on vacation. It was such a shame in those days. And so then the twins would be adopted, and they split the twins up, one in this family, one in that family, and the twins didn't know it. Nowadays, that's considered cruel. And then they studied these twins for 20 years. And they wanted to answer, because these are identical twins, so the genes are the same. Which is more important, nature or nurture? Interesting study, isn't it? And the answer was 50% was the nature, the genes. The kids often would dress alike, even though they never met each other, and had many things in common. But the nurture turned out to be different than they thought. They studied how the parents brought them up and everything. That only contributed 10%. What was the other 40%? Wow, what was that? Friends, exactly, friends, who they hung out with, had a much larger effect than the scientists had anticipated.
Well, that's what I meant by nurture.
Nurture, you got it right then.
Because it takes a village to.
Exactly the point. Exactly the point. So nurture is really, and that's what Prabhupada said, sadhu sangha. Who we hang out with is really important. And the biggest decision one can make is who I'm going to hang out with. When I was in the Peace Corps in India, I hung out with my friends, my colleagues. There were 3 of us that were itinerant teachers, and we didn't exactly follow the regulative principle of intoxication. Not entirely. In other words, we were stoned every day. And because in India it was readily available. And so when I met Prabhupada, I wanted to give it up. I realized it was just weakening my brain. But when you're with people who do it, you do it. So I met Prabhupada, and immediately I had no desire anymore. Just gave it up. And when I went back to my friends, I realized I can't be with them. Even though we were good buddies, I couldn't be with them. It was bad association. And I came back to America right away. As Prabhupada said, good association. I realized how important that is. Good association to me does not mean someone who has tilak and neck beads. It means someone I trust. That's what it means. Many people with tilak and all who I appreciate at a distance. It means who I can reveal my mind to, who I can be close to. Do you have a question? Comment,
I have
please.
2 quick comments.
Please.
One based on talks by Bhaktivedanta Maharaj. One comment refers to Advaita Prabhu and Gopi Jivana Prabhu's comments. And Maharaj says that the way to look at life as a cycle or reincarnation, and then there's a other one as a linear. So there's beginning and the end. He says that ultimately, if somebody sees it as a beginning and there is an end and there is no repetition, he says ultimately it's a demoniac way of life. In other words, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die.
Yeah, exactly.
But if there is a cycle, then we know, okay, I'm going to take a responsibility for my actions in next life. And the second comment is based on the consciousness sometimes being reserved to transfer to next body. Maharaj says that sometimes, well, not sometimes, but actually that consciousness very often leaves a mark on a physical body. And he said that memory of the consciousness is stored in the heart. And he said there was a couple of cases, and again, those cases in a European or Western country is not really so, just shrugged off. But during a heart transplant, there was 2 cases when one girl got heart transferred from not the girl, but the other girl who gave a heart, she was killed, she was murdered. And the other girl who got her heart, she started having nightmares of being killed. Yeah. And ultimately, she helped to solve the crime and find her killer of that girl. Another lady, she was a vegetarian her whole life. She was like in her 60s, very nice. She had to get a heart transplant. And after she got a heart transplant, she started having craving for beer and hard metal rock, because the heart was from a teenager who died in a car crash. So the consciousness, it leaves a really hard mark on a physical body. So that's also interesting.
Thank you for sharing that. And there are plenty of stories. One more question.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that actually there's not even a need for such extreme cases as separation of twins, because I have a twin sister who is identical.
I'll speak up a little bit more.
I have a twin sister who is identical, and
Yeah.
we can already see so much of shifts happening, and we are like totally two different personalities.
Yeah.
And yet also what's interesting and clear is that there's nature, and then there's also almost like the pathway of channeling the nature. And so that also shows like the association, because even though our natures are so similar, they're also channeled so differently, and we can even like point, to the gunas and stuff like that, how they're working, although she's not a devotee. So
Yeah, and I, and in a similar way, I do see another phenomena, and that's interesting what you say, and I've seen that. And then you have also we have like Johnny Voss and his brother. They were identical twins, and they both became pujaris in Mayapur. One passed on. In fact, one twin would go to Nepal every year because they have to leave the country to keep their India visa. He would go to Nepal, get his passport stamp, come back to India, then take his brother's passport and go back to Nepal and get it stamped and come back. And we find many siblings end up being devotees, but sometimes they're identical twins who go different directions. So there's many iterations to that. That's interesting. Okay, well, thank you all very much. Have a good Purushottama month. And one thing Giriraj Swami recommends, which I started yesterday, and I have good news for you, you'll see in a moment. He recommends reading the 15th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita every day. We'll have the good news in a minute. And the 15th chapter is talking about Purushottama. It's the Purushottama chapter of the Gita, the Supreme Person, his characteristics. Now, the good news, it's only 20 verses. So that's not even a big burden. So you may want to read that and get that to kind of enter your psyche. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna.
The Lord is from all kinds of sins. Must eat food which is offered first for sacrifice. Others who prepare food for personal sense enjoyment. Ready to eat once. Bhagavad Mahaprashadam ki jai.